What happens when a man boards a plane with nothing but silence, and that silence ends up shaking an entire company? What if one calm voice, in the face of public humiliation, had the power to stop a flight and start a movement? This isn't just a story about a seat in first class. It's about what happens when dignity refuses to move. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The cafe near Phoenix Sky Harbor wasn't anything fancy. Just a little place tucked between a dry cleaner and a tired old gas station, with a few mismatched tables, a coffee machine that hissed too loudly, and a faint jazz tune playing from a corner speaker that crackled every now and then. Ellis Braxton sat near the window. He wasn't the kind of man you'd notice right away, not flashy, not loud. Just calm. Present. A man who didn't need to wear a title on his sleeve because he'd already lived through enough chapters to earn quiet. He stirred his coffee slowly, eyes half on the street, half on his thoughts. His flight was in a little over an hour. First class ticket. Altair Air. He wasn't thinking about the seat, though. He was thinking about the conference in D.C., about the panel discussion on equity in aviation, about whether he'd still have the patience to smile when the questions started sounding like polite excuses. Mr. Braxton? He looked up. A young man, mid-20s, nervous hands, stood holding a tray with a cup of black coffee. His name tag read Malik. I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted to thank you. Ellis blinked. For what? I got the scholarship. Braxton Equity. You signed the letter. It changed everything. Ellis offered a quiet smile, the kind that didn't need words. Malik set the coffee down, his hands still shaking a little. My mom, she cried when the email came. Said it was the first time anyone saw my worth without asking for proof. Ellis nodded once. Then make it count. He didn't say much more. He never did. But as Malik walked away, Ellis let out a breath and glanced at his watch. It was time. The airport was busy. It always was. People in suits with laptops, families juggling kids and carry-ons, older couples arguing gently over gate numbers. Ellis moved through it all like water through rocks, quiet, unbothered. At the gate, a man in a slate gray suit gave him a quick once-over. No scowl. No words. Just that familiar flick of the eyes that said you probably don't belong here. Ellis had seen it more times than he could count. He didn't take it personally anymore. But he didn't ignore it either. Boarding was smooth. Ellis handed over his ticket and stepped into the jet bridge, the hum of the plane growing louder with each step. First class was mostly empty, a quiet space with leather seats and the faint scent of citrus-scented wipes. He placed his bag overhead, careful not to bump the passenger behind him. His coat was buttoned, dark cashmere, and his shoes were soft leather, clean, but not shouting for attention. Around his neck hung a pair of headphones, unused. He was just lowering himself into his seat when it came. Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat? This is first class. The voice was crisp, female. Not rude exactly, but clipped, like someone already preparing for an argument. Ellis turned. The flight attendant was mid-30s, blonde hair in a tight bun. Uniform neat to perfection. Her name tag read Margot. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her the ticket without a word. She took it, glanced, flipped it over, looked again. Then back at him. She didn't hand it back right away. Finally, she did. No apology. Just a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you. She turned and walked off. No, enjoy your flight. No welcome. Just distance. Ellis sat back into his seat, hands resting calmly on the armrests, as if nothing had just happened. But behind that stillness, a storm moved slowly inside him. Not anger. He had learned long ago not to give people the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool, but something quieter, heavier, a kind of tiredness that didn't live in the muscles, but in the soul. He glanced down at his hands. They'd once clenched at moments like these. Now, they only flexed slightly, just enough to let him know he still felt it, that he hadn't grown numb, no matter how many times it happened. A couple across the aisle whispered to each other. The man, mid-60s with silver hair and a plaid shirt tucked too neatly into his jeans, gave Ellis a sideways glance. His wife, wearing oversized glasses and gripping a hardback mystery novel, didn't look at Ellis at all. Just cleared her throat and shifted in her seat. Nobody said anything. Not to him. Not to the flight attendant. Just silence. It wasn't a cruel silence. It was worse than that. It was the kind of silence people wrapped around themselves when they didn't want to take sides. When they'd rather be comfortable than courageous. Ellis had seen that silence in boardrooms, in courtrooms, even at family dinners. And somehow, it always cut a little deeper when it came from strangers who didn't owe him anything, but still chose to look away. He reached for his phone, not to scroll or distract himself, but to look at a photo he kept saved for moments like this. It was of a group of kids, black, brown, even a few white, standing on the steps of a flight school, smiling, holding certificates with his name on them. Braxton Aviation Scholarship Program. That was what kept him steady. From the galley, he noticed a younger flight attendant, Jenny, her tag red, glance in his direction. She looked uncertain, even a little sorry, like she wanted to say something but didn't quite dare. Her eyes darted to Margot, then back to Ellis. And then she looked away. Ellis didn't blame her. Not really. He understood how power worked, who had it, who thought they did, and who learned to survive by staying quiet. He'd seen that look on interns and junior staff his whole life. And sometimes he'd worn it himself. His phone vibrated. A message from Candace, his executive assistant. Colton is flying out of Phoenix this morning. Gate 12. Probably for the quarterly review. Ellis's brow rose slightly. Colton Greaves, the CEO of Altair Air, was in the same terminal, probably walking the same halls, breathing the same filtered air. 2 years ago, when Altair faced public backlash over a racial profiling incident at one of their gates, Ellis had gone on record defending the company, not because they were innocent, but because their leadership promised real change, promised accountability. He remembered sitting in a hotel conference room with Colton and 4 board members, watching them squirm as he laid out a plan that would either improve their culture or expose them. "I'm not here to save your brand," he'd said. "I'm here to see if it deserves saving." Back then, Colton had listened, even signed the deal that would send Braxton scholars into Altair's training programs, flight crews, engineers, even management fast tracks. But promises on paper only meant so much. Ellis never expected them to fix a system overnight. But he also hadn't expected this, not on one of their own planes. Margot returned. Her heels made sharp clicks on the carpet, even though she was clearly trying to sound soft. "Mr. Braxton," she said, tone tighter now, like she'd rehearsed it just enough to pretend she wasn't defensive. "We just need to confirm the upgrade. We've had errors before." Ellis didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even meet her eyes at first. Instead, he opened a text window, typed a message to Candace. "Document everything. Stand by." Then he looked up at Margot, gave her a slow, polite nod. The kind that didn't mean agreement, just acknowledgement. The kind that said, "You may proceed, but I'm not the one being watched now." She turned and left. And Ellis just exhaled. Outside the plane, a line of baggage carts rolled by. The sunlight bounced off the side of the fuselage, catching his eye for a second. Inside, the cabin still buzzed with unspoken things. But Ellis Braxton didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't try to make anyone comfortable, because comfort had never changed anything. And he hadn't spent a lifetime building a voice just to raise it when no one was really listening. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a man can do is wait. Wait for the moment the system tries to eat itself. Wait for the silence to grow too loud. Wait for someone to realize. He never needed a first-class seat to prove he belonged in it. Ellis reached for his headphones. It was a simple motion, slow, almost graceful. He wasn't trying to send a message. He just wanted a moment of silence, the kind you earned, not demanded. A few notes of soft jazz were all he was after. Nothing more. Nothing loud. But the music never made it to his ears. Margot returned. This time, her shoes hit the carpet a little harder. Her voice, when it came, wasn't sharp, but it carried something new. Urgency wrapped in control. "Sir," she said, with that same half-professional, half-condescending tone, "I'm asking you to step out until we verify your ticket. Please cooperate." The phrase, "please cooperate," hung in the air like static. Ellis didn't answer right away. He looked up at her, calm, measured. Then slowly he stood, not in protest, not in compliance, just stood. He took out his phone, tapped the camera app, turned it toward himself and her. Without breaking eye contact, he held up his boarding pass in front of the camera. "You may proceed," he said softly, "but this is being documented." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a performance. It was the kind of sentence that came from someone who'd seen too many rooms where people pretended not to see. 2 rows behind him, a young man, mid-30s, flannel shirt, earbuds out, started filming too. His expression wasn't angry, just focused, like he'd seen something like this before and didn't want to let it slip away without record. Margot froze for half a breath. Then her eyes darted toward the other passengers. Some were looking out the window. Others, pretending to read, had clearly stopped turning pages. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the galley. Ellis remained standing, phone still recording. He could feel it now, the energy in the cabin shifting. Not tension, not yet, but something close, like a pot of water on the edge of a boil. Less than a minute later, Margot returned. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 TSA agents followed her into the cabin. One tall, one stocky, both wearing that bureaucratic blend of politeness and authority. Their presence didn't shout danger. It whispered control. Margot pointed. Her voice clipped but steady. "There's a gentleman in the wrong seat, refusing to comply." The taller agent turned to Ellis. "Sir, may we see your boarding pass?" Ellis didn't speak. He just held it up. The agent took it, scanned it into a handheld reader. A short beep followed. Then the screen lit up. Verified, priority guest. The silence that followed was unlike the one before. It wasn't indifference anymore. It was something else. It was discomfort. It was the weight of watching something go too far. Of realizing, too late, that you'd been a witness to more than a misunderstanding. The shorter TSA agent handed the ticket back with a stiff nod. "You're all set, sir. Sorry for the trouble." Ellis took it, pocketed his phone, and sat back down. No smile. No sigh. Just calm. He put his headphones back around his neck, not on his ears. It was too quiet now for music. Too real. Someone coughed. Another person whispered, "Jesus." Then, from a third row, an older man, white hair, corduroy blazer, the kind who usually kept himself, leaned toward his wife and murmured just loud enough. They really tried to get rid of him. And he didn't even raise his voice. Ellis heard it. He wasn't sure if it was meant for him to hear or not. But he did. And that made all the difference. Because the truth wasn't in what Margot said. It wasn't in what the agents did. It was in the silence that came after. In the way people began to shift in their seats. In the way eyes dropped and phones stopped recording, not because the drama ended, but because it had changed shape. The real story wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was the realization, spreading row by row, that the man they'd quietly questioned never needed to prove himself. Ellis didn't move again. Didn't speak. He just waited. Not for justice. Not for apology. But for the next move. Because now, whatever happened next wouldn't be just about him. It would be about all the people watching, who suddenly had no excuse for what they chose to do or not do in the silence. Ellis sat back down slowly, not because he was tired, but because he needed stillness. His hands rested on his lap, fingers loosely clasped. His eyes locked on the back of the seat ahead, not in defiance, not in surrender. Just still. Outwardly, he looked composed. Inwardly, something deeper had started to stir. Not anger. Not the kind that shouts or shakes fists. This was older than that. Heavier. Like standing in the middle of a quiet storm and knowing the worst of it hadn't passed yet. A voice inside him, small but insistent, wanted to rise. Wanted to turn and speak to every passenger in that cabin. To ask, not with fury, but with ache, "Where were you when she questioned me, when they brought in security? Why did none of you speak?" He wanted to ask Margot what, exactly she thought she was protecting? Company policy? Her pride? Or the comfort of a world that still told itself it knew what belonging looked like? But another voice, wiser, practiced, spoke louder inside him. A voice shaped by years of boardrooms, press interviews, and school gymnasiums packed with kids who saw their whole future hanging on a scholarship letter. That voice reminded him, this isn't about showing your power. It's about knowing when to use it. He wasn't there for a performance. He was there for the ones who couldn't afford to lose their composure. Not yet, not when they were just starting to find their place in a world that wasn't made for them. He exhaled slowly and let his gaze drift down to the floor, then back up to the seat ahead, the faded stitching, the scuff mark near the bottom corner, the faint imprint of someone else's weight. Proof that people passed through these spaces every day without incident. Proof that all this could have been avoided if someone, somewhere, had simply chosen not to assume. His phone vibrated. A message from Candace. Mr. Greaves just arrived at gate 12. He's boarding. Ellis didn't shift, didn't blink, but inside something clicked. Not a jolt, just a quiet alignment of pieces. Carlton Greaves, CEO of Altair Air. The man Ellis had once sat across from at a long glass table in a room too quiet for its own good. Back then, Ellis had made him a deal. Fund reform from the inside, or prepare to watch the company bleed public trust. Carlton had nodded, signed, smiled for the press. And now here they both were. Two men with very different understandings of accountability, sharing the same flight, the same cabin, the same moment. Up front, Margot moved stiffly as she tapped at her tablet, avoiding Ellis's eyes like they might burn through her if she looked too long. Her professionalism, so crisp earlier, had softened into something else. Not regret, yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Then came the sound of a briefcase handle clicking against metal, footsteps that didn't rush, didn't pause. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped into the cabin. Carlton Greaves didn't scan the crowd like most executives. He moved with purpose, the kind of presence you couldn't teach. But the second his eyes landed on Ellis, that presence faltered. Just slightly. Enough to tell everyone paying attention that something had changed. Mr. Braxton, he said, a little too loudly. I had no idea you were flying with us today. The ripple moved fast. Heads turned. Whispers sparked like static between rows. Margot froze. Ellis didn't turn his head. Didn't smile. Apparently neither did your team. Greaves scanned the cabin. His eyes found the young man in the flannel shirt still filming from behind his phone. Then the elderly couple across the aisle, now sitting a little straighter, hands still. They were watching. All of them. He gave a single, tight nod. Ms. Vick, step outside with me. Now. No softening. No sugarcoat. Just 5 words spoken like a switch being flipped. Margot hesitated. Just for a second. Then she gathered her tablet, lowered her eyes, and walked out. She didn't say a word. No one said a word to her. She passed the rows without acknowledgement, no support, no side-eye defense. And for the first time, she looked back just slightly, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might silently validate her. She didn't. The curtain closed behind her, and the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else. Ellis sat motionless, but the weight of the room had shifted. The cold spotlight wasn't just on him anymore, because now everyone had seen it. And suddenly, he wasn't the only one being judged. Carlton returned to the cabin a few minutes later, his face as unreadable as a closed courtroom file. The cabin had gone back to a strange stillness, the kind that filled up all the space not claimed by words. Ellis didn't turn around. He sat exactly where he'd been, hands resting on the armrests, spine straight, gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the headrest in front of him. But inside, he was listening, watching, waiting. Carlton stopped beside Margot, who stood near the galley with her arms crossed too tightly across her chest. She looked like she was trying to hold herself together, but her expression betrayed something. Fear, frustration, maybe even shame. Ms. Vick, Carlton began, voice low but firm, walk me through what happened. I followed protocol, she replied. Her voice was clipped, formal. The same tone Ellis had heard earlier, but now it trembled at the edges. Carlton didn't blink. Protocol doesn't require humiliation. It requires judgment. You failed both. The air shifted. Passengers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. A baby, somewhere farther back in the cabin, let out a soft wail that quickly died down. Margot swallowed. She looked at him as if she wanted to fight back. But she didn't. There wasn't much left to say. Carlton turned toward Ellis now. He cleared his throat slightly, enough to pull the attention of everyone around them. "Mr. Braxton," he said louder this time, "on behalf of Altair Air, I want to sincerely apologize for how you were treated. This is not how we conduct ourselves, or how we intend to move forward." Ellis didn't answer right away. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Carlton's, not in anger, but in something deeper. A kind of disappointment that didn't need words to be understood. "I appreciate the apology," Ellis said finally. "But let's not pretend this was about one person or one moment." Carlton nodded once. But Ellis wasn't done. "This isn't the first time I've had to sit quietly in a seat I paid for, waiting for someone to remember I belong there. The difference today is people were watching." That landed harder than any raised voice ever could. Carlton turned to the rest of the cabin. His eyes swept the faces, young, old, black, white, curious, uncomfortable. "If anyone else here feels Mr. Braxton doesn't belong in this seat," he said clearly, "speak now. Or forever accept that this right here, is what change looks like." No one spoke. Not the woman in the gray cardigan with her Kindle clutched to her chest. Not the businessman who had whispered earlier. Not even the younger flight attendant, Jenny, who stood near the beverage cart biting her lip. Just silence. And not the kind that protected anyone anymore. Ellis let that moment stretch. Let it breathe. Then, quietly, he looked at Carlton again. "This shouldn't need a CEO on board to be handled right," he said, voice calm but sharp. "It should have been corrected the second it went wrong. Without the cameras. Without the theater." Carlton opened his mouth to respond, but Ellis raised a hand. Just enough to stop him. "I've funded Altair's diversity pipeline for 3 years now," Ellis said, for the first time addressing the room as much as the man. "Millions of dollars. Hundreds of young people of color entering aviation, pilots, engineers, leadership roles. But as of last quarter, the benchmarks you agreed to haven't been met." There was a rustle of movement from a few seats away. A woman gasped. Someone whispered something unintelligible. Ellis kept going. "My foundation is reviewing whether that funding continues," he said simply. "Because it was never meant to be a PR strategy. It was meant to be a partnership." Carlton didn't move. He just nodded slowly, once. "I understand," he said. Ellis leaned back in his seat. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Not in a weak way, more like someone who'd spent years pushing a boulder uphill and had just realized the hill was steeper than he thought. "It's not about punishing anyone," he said. "It's about deciding if this flight is still going where I thought it was headed." And with that, he put his headphones back on, not to drown out the world, but to mark that, for him, the conversation was over. The rest of the cabin? It stayed quiet. But this time, the silence was carrying something different. This time, it felt like everyone knew exactly who had just taken control of the cockpit. Carlton leaned over Ellis's seat, voice low, tried to sound cooperative, maybe even a little nervous. "If you'd rather not continue this flight, Mr. Braxton, I completely understand. We can arrange another." Ellis didn't let him finish. "Let the plane fly," he said, still looking straight ahead. "Let people see what accountability looks like at 35,000 feet. The words landed heavier than they sounded. Carlton stood frozen for a beat, as if trying to decide whether to protest. But he didn't. He nodded and walked back toward the galley without saying another word. It didn't take long before murmurs returned to the cabin. Some passengers pulled out their phones, others leaned across aisles. One woman whispered something while pointing in Ellis's direction, and a college-age girl a few rows back pulled up her Twitter app. Jenny, the younger flight attendant, returned to first class and moved with more careful steps now. She offered water, forced a smile, then turned quickly away when Ellis declined with a polite nod. The calm wouldn't last. Margot returned from the front of the plane, her face visibly tighter now, as if every breath she took had to push past the weight of what had just unfolded. She paused next to Ellis's seat, one hand holding the back of it, the other twisting the edge of her uniform. "I wasn't trying to insult you," she said, her voice thin and measured. "I've had issues. We were warned about frauds, fake upgrades, scams using loyalty points. I've been written up before, and—" Ellis turned his head, just enough to look at her, but not enough to give her what she was searching for. "Margot," he said, gently but firmly, "we all have our stories." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't speak. "But when you wear that uniform," Ellis continued, "you're not just yourself anymore. You're the system people have to trust, especially the ones who've been told their whole lives not to." She looked down. The tension in her shoulders eased, then snapped back. She was caught between self-preservation and shame, and it was showing in the way she held herself, like someone trying to stand still on a moving train. Carlton returned just in time to catch the end of the exchange. "We failed you, Mr. Braxton," he said, louder now, for everyone to hear. "That's not up for debate. Training, oversight, accountability, we haven't done enough. I own that." Ellis didn't nod, didn't soften. "You do. But so does she." He looked up at Margot again. "This isn't about one bad call. It's about how easy it was for you to make it, and how certain you were that no one would call it out." Margot flinched slightly, like the words had landed where a slap might have just grazed. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "That," Ellis said quietly, "is the real problem." It was the first time his voice carried something sharper than patience. Not rage, but close, like a crack forming in stone after too many years of quiet pressure. No one spoke for a while after that. The captain came over the speaker, announcing the flight would resume shortly. But in that moment, no one was thinking about departure times or gate changes. They were thinking about the weight of what they'd just witnessed, and who they'd just misjudged. Ellis sat back again, finally closing his eyes for a moment. Not because he was tired, but because everything inside him was alert. Not angry, not triumphant, just ready. Ready for the moment this would no longer be about him at all. Because somewhere in some flight school classroom or in a crowded apartment where a kid was watching this play out on a phone screen, there was someone who needed to know that staying composed didn't mean staying quiet, and that sometimes the loudest kind of justice came from holding your line when everyone expected you to fold. The captain stepped out into the cabin, not hurried, not smiling, just present. He held the small mic close to his mouth and glanced across the rows, as if choosing his words with care. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it lacked the usual sing-song polish that passengers had come to expect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing, "due to a staffing matter that requires immediate attention, this flight will be delayed an additional 15 minutes. We appreciate your patience." The announcement landed softly, but it echoed loud in the silence that followed. It was a statement dressed in calm, but everyone knew. This wasn't weather. It wasn't a maintenance issue. It was a reckoning. The captain nodded once, turned, and disappeared behind the curtain. People didn't ask questions, not out loud. They shifted in their seats, glanced at one another with half-expressed curiosity and the restraint of people who didn't want to get involved, but also didn't want to miss a thing. The man in the flannel shirt lowered his phone slightly, but didn't stop recording. A woman across the aisle began typing on her iPad without looking up. And toward the back, someone let out a slow sigh like they knew this moment would be talked about for years. Carlton walked back down the aisle like he was moving through something thicker than air. Every step was deliberate, heavy with intent. He stopped beside Margot, who stood near the galley. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. But her eyes weren't combative anymore. They were tired. As if she, too, had known this was coming from the moment she raised her voice at the wrong man. "You need to step off," Carlton said. His voice was quiet but firm, like a door closing without a slam. "You're no longer fit to represent us on this flight." Margot didn't flinch, didn't argue. Her lips pressed into a line. For a second, she looked around, not defiant, but human, as if searching the faces for something to hold onto. Some hint of understanding, of forgiveness, or even pity. She didn't find it. She picked up her tablet, straightened the hem of her blazer, and began her walk toward the front. It was slow, not dramatic, just final. She passed the rows where she'd once given orders, poured drinks, smiled on cue. No one spoke. No one stopped her. Some didn't look at her at all. But the ones who did, they didn't offer sympathy. They offered distance. Uneasy glances. Shrinking eye contact. Maybe one or two held a flicker of compassion, but it was guarded, careful, and silent. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't gloating. It was the kind of silence that followed a shift. The kind that said, "This is different now." Once she was gone, something invisible lifted from the air. Like the pressure had dropped just enough for people to breathe again. Ellis hadn't moved. He stayed where he was, hands folded loosely, gaze forward. But his fingers weren't clenched. There was no sense of victory in him, no satisfaction. Just stillness. The kind that comes not when the battle is over, but when the noise has stopped long enough for you to feel what it cost you to stay standing. A few minutes later, the co-pilot approached quietly, leaning in close. "Mr. Braxton," he said, voice respectful, "the captain would like to invite you to the front. If you'd like to say something to the cabin, we can patch you through." Ellis looked up at him, thoughtful. He didn't rush the moment. "No need," he said. "They've already heard enough." The co-pilot gave a small nod and stepped away. Ellis reached for his phone, opened his email, and began typing a message. His thumbs moved slowly, but confidently. The subject line was short. "Let this flight be the lesson we all learn from." He sent it to every senior staff member at Altair, people who mattered, people who made decisions. He didn't ask for anything. Just a reminder. Just a line in the sand. Outside the window, the lights of the runway glowed against the dusk like fireflies lined in perfect order. The plane began to taxi. The cabin lights dimmed. In the seat just behind him, a small voice whispered, barely louder than a breath. "Mom, I want to be like him." Ellis didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The mother didn't speak. She just reached out, tucked a curl behind her daughter's ear, and stared out the window. Ellis leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes. The hum of the engine filled the silence, soft and steady. This wasn't payback. This wasn't the kind of justice that gets written into press releases or carved into headlines. It was something simpler, a quiet stand in a loud world, a refusal to shrink. And as the wheels left the ground and the nose of the plane tilted toward the sky, Ellis felt it. Not triumph, not closure, just lightness. The kind that comes when you know you didn't lose yourself to prove your worth. The hum of the plane was steady, almost meditative. It had been nearly an hour since takeoff, and the sky outside was a calm canvas of pale blue and scattered clouds. From his window seat, Ellis Braxton stared out at nothing in particular. His posture was upright, but his shoulders had softened. The kind of softness that only came when the hardest part was behind you. In front of him, his laptop was open. The screen glowed faintly against the dimmed cabin lights. He wasn't checking his inbox. He wasn't reviewing a speech. He was typing, slowly, intentionally. Not for applause. Not for headlines. Just to say what needed to be said. No system can call itself fair if silence is the only thing holding it together. He read it twice, then hit send. The message went out to Altair's entire senior leadership team. Short, sharp, unmistakable. It wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder. One that couldn't be softened by spin or buried by PR. By the time the wheels touched down in D.C., the story had already taken flight. The cell phone video, shaky and grainy, had gone viral. Just 30 seconds of footage. A man in first class, calm, composed, standing his ground while a flight attendant questioned his presence. The moment wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That was the point. The media gave it names. The man who delayed a flight with a single look. The calm that shook the cabin. Power without a podium. Ellis read none of it. Not out of arrogance, but because he'd already lived the truth of it. The next morning, Altair Air issued a statement. a formal apology, and a public commitment to change. Not vague promises. Specifics. Immediate retraining for flight crews. An independent audit of internal hiring and promotion processes. A measurable goal, 25% increase in minority leadership within 12 months. It was more than most companies ever did. Ellis didn't clap, didn't post, didn't give interviews. Instead, he walked into a closed-door meeting with Altire's board and laid out his conditions. Transparency, independent oversight, clear timelines, regular progress reviews. No more checkboxes. No more good intentions without results. They said yes. Not because they wanted to, but because now the world was watching. As for Margot Vick, she didn't return to the skies. But it wasn't a termination. It was something quieter. She was offered a role in the company's internal training division, with one requirement. She'd have to complete a full program on unconscious bias, procedural justice, and frontline accountability. For days, she said nothing. Then finally she agreed. Some called it window dressing, a safe way for the airline to avoid bad press. But Ellis didn't see it that way. He didn't need her fired. He needed her changed. Because the truth was, she wasn't the only one. And if she could be made to see, really see, then maybe the next moment like this wouldn't end in headlines at all. A week later, Ellis found himself back where the story began, South Phoenix. Not in an airport lounge or boardroom, but in a modest community hall filled with folding chairs, young voices, and cups of lemonade. The local STEM initiative was hosting a youth panel. Aviation, engineering, public service. 1 mic, 10 chairs, and a wall painted with dreams. Malik was there. This time, he wasn't serving coffee. He was seated at the front, legs crossed, notes in hand, speaking into the mic with steady confidence. And when the panel ended, he walked straight to Ellis with a quiet fire in his eyes. "I saw the clip," Malik said. "And when a guy in class joked that I got the scholarship because they needed the numbers, I didn't flinch. I told him he was lucky someone held the door open before him." Ellis didn't say much, just placed a hand on Malik's shoulder and gave it a firm, wordless squeeze. "Then it worked," he said softly. They spoke a little longer. Nothing too heavy. Just enough. Then Malik slipped away to help clean up, still smiling, this time not out of gratitude, but pride. Ellis lingered by the door, watching people trickle out beneath the warm Arizona sky. It was late afternoon. The sun painted the street in a slow golden wash. Somewhere in the distance, a plane soared overhead, low and wide, its engines soft like a memory. Ellis tilted his head up, tracking its path for a moment. Across the street, on a modest apartment balcony, a little girl leaned over the railing and waved. Just a child, 5 or 6, eyes wide, hair in braids, no phone, no agenda. Just a wave. Ellis raised his hand and returned the gesture. A small smile formed on his lips, not the kind meant for cameras or statements. Just for her. Just for this moment. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay still. And sometimes justice doesn't land with thunder. It lands softly, on a runway paved by quiet resistance, and the steady hands of those who never stopped believing it mattered. So what does it really take to change something that's always looked the other way? Maybe it's not power or status or even the perfect words. Maybe it's the courage to stay calm when everything in you wants to shout. Maybe it's the quiet ones, like Ellis, who teach us that dignity, once claimed, doesn't have to ask permission. What would you have done in his seat? If this story made you pause, think, or feel something deeper, don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the credits roll.